You don't feel loved. You feel tolerated, like you're close enough to touch them, but never close enough to reach them. They say they care. They show up sometimes. They disappear often. And somehow, you're the one questioning yourself. Not because you're too needy, not because you asked for too much, but because loving them slowly trained you to abandon yourself. This isn't about how to fix them. It's about understanding what being close to an avoidant does to you, and why the more you try to hold the connection together, the emptier you feel inside. At first, it doesn't feel unhealthy. It feels subtle. You tell yourself, they're just independent, emotionally reserved, bad at communication. You respect their space. You admire their self-sufficiency. You pride yourself on being understanding. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to shrink. Not dramatically, quietly. You pause before sending texts. You rehearse emotions before sharing them. You soften needs into suggestions. You explain things that don't need explaining. Because every time you express closeness, they retreat just enough to make you doubt yourself. So you adapt. You become calmer, less expressive, more low maintenance. Not because that's who you are, but because that's what keeps them near. And this is where the damage begins. Because loving an avoidant partner doesn't break you all at once. It erodes you, little by little. You stop trusting your instincts. You feel lonely. While being in a relationship, you crave intimacy, but feel guilty for wanting it. You sense distance, but are told everything is fine. And the most confusing part? They're not cruel. They're not abusive. They're not always absent, which makes the emptiness harder to justify. So you blame yourself instead. You wonder if you're asking for too much, if you're being dramatic, if your needs are unreasonable. But here's the truth most people miss. Avoidant partners don't create chaos. They create emotional ambiguity. And ambiguity is destabilizing because there's no clear rejection to push against, no obvious betrayal to leave over, just enough connection to keep you hoping, just enough distance to keep you unsettled. Your nervous system never rests. You're always adjusting, always calibrating, always watching for cues. Did I say too much? Was that the wrong tone? Am I asking at the wrong time? And slowly, your internal world begins revolving around theirs. This is how self-loss happens, not through control, but through inconsistency. Avoidant partners often don't withdraw because they don't care. They withdraw because closeness activates threat. Intimacy feels like exposure. Dependence feels like danger. Being needed feels like pressure. So when things start feeling emotionally real, their system pulls back. They go quiet. They become vague. They focus on work, distractions, autonomy, and you're left holding the emotional weight alone, trying to stabilize something that keeps slipping through your fingers. This is why you feel exhausted, because you're doing emotional labor for two people. You're regulating your feelings and compensating for theirs. You're soothing discomfort that isn't even yours. And here's the part that hurts the most. The more you adapt to keep the connection alive, the less visible you become. Your feelings don't disappear. They go underground. They show up as anxiety, as resentment, as numbness. You may start fantasizing about leaving while still longing for closeness. You feel guilty for wanting more, but empty settling for less. This internal contradiction is not a flaw. It's a signal. Your system is trying to tell you that something is out of alignment. Avoidant dynamics condition you to prioritize stability over truth. You learn that peace comes from not rocking the boat. That closeness is something you earn through restraint. That expressing yourself risks losing connection. So you choose connection over authenticity. Again and again and again until you don't recognize yourself anymore. You might notice you've stopped bringing things up, not because they don't matter, but because you're tired of the emotional cost. You might feel disconnected from your own desires, unsure what you want, uncertain what's reasonable. That confusion is not accidental. It's the byproduct of emotional minimization. When your needs are consistently unmet, but not explicitly denied, your brain starts negotiating with itself. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe this is just how relationships are. Maybe love isn't supposed to feel safe. But love is not supposed to feel like self-betrayal. And this is where many people get stuck, because they confuse understanding someone's trauma with sacrificing their own well-being. Yes, avoidant attachment is rooted in early conditioning. Yes, it's protective. Yes, it's not malicious. But empathy does not require self-erasure. And understanding someone's nervous system does not mean living in emotional deprivation. A healthy relationship does not ask you to disappear in order to be chosen. If closeness consistently costs you your voice, your vitality, your sense of worth, that's not love growing. That's you shrinking. And here's something crucial. Avoidant partners often feel safest when you ask for less. So the more you silence yourself, the more stable the relationship appears. But stability built on suppression is not safety, it's containment. And your body knows the difference. That's why you feel restless. That's why you feel heavy. That's why you feel like something is missing, even when nothing is technically wrong. You're grieving intimacy that never fully formed. You're longing for reciprocity that was promised but never embodied. And you're trying to make peace with crumbs because part of you still hopes they'll eventually choose closeness. But avoidance doesn't soften under pressure. It retreats. And the more you chase clarity, the more they pull away. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because intimacy threatens the very defenses that keep them regulated. This dynamic is not solved by better communication alone, because it's not about words. It's about capacity. Someone can care deeply and still be unable to show up consistently. Someone can want connection and still panic when it becomes real. And someone can love you without being able to love you well. That distinction matters because staying in a relationship where you are consistently emotionally alone teaches you to normalize loneliness. It teaches you to override your needs, to intellectualize pain, to call endurance maturity. But there is nothing enlightened about abandoning yourself for attachment. The quiet cost of loving an avoidant partner is not heartbreak. It's disconnection from your own inner compass. You stop asking, "What do I feel?" and start asking, "How do I keep this from falling apart?" And that shift, that is where the void forms. Not because they're bad, not because you're broken, but because intimacy cannot survive, where one person must disappear to keep the bond intact. And eventually, your system will demand a reckoning, not in drama, not in ultimatums, but in exhaustion, in numbness, in a quiet moment where you realize you've been holding space for someone who has never truly held space for you, and something inside you is ready to stop. What makes this dynamic so hard to leave is not love, it's conditioning. Your nervous system didn't attach to who they are now. It attached to who they almost were, to the moments of warmth, to the flashes of closeness, to the version of them that appeared right before they pulled away. That intermittent availability is what wires the bond, because unpredictability doesn't calm the nervous system, it hooks it. Your brain starts chasing resolution. You replay conversations. You analyze tone. You wait for the next opening, not because you're weak, but because uncertainty creates fixation. The absence feels loud because your system is trying to restore balance. This is why logic doesn't work here. People tell you to just leave, to choose yourself, to stop overthinking. But you're not overthinking. You're dysregulated. Your body learned to associate closeness with effort, connection with restraint, love with waiting. So even when you pull away physically, part of you is still orbiting emotionally. You might stop texting, but you still check your phone. You might create distance, but you still imagine conversations. Because detachment is not a decision, it's a process, and no one tells you. That being with an avoidant partner trains you to abandon your own signals. You stop trusting your gut because it keeps telling you something isn't right, and yet nothing is wrong enough to leave. So you stay suspended between hope and resignation, between longing and self-doubt. This is the emotional limbo that drains you. And here's something crucial. Avoidant partners don't usually ask you to disappear. They let you do it yourself. They reward low demand. They relax when you ask for less. They become warmer when you stop needing. So your system learns. Silence equals safety. Need equals distance. And that lesson doesn't stay contained to the relationship. It follows you. You become hesitant elsewhere. You downplay excitement. You second-guess vulnerability because part of you learned that being fully seen comes at a cost. And here's the quiet grief no one talks about. You don't just miss them. You miss the version of yourself you were before you learned to be smaller, before you measured your words, before you softened your needs, before you learned to survive on partial presence. That loss hurts more than the relationship itself. And still, leaving feels terrifying because when you're bonded to avoidance, absence feels like danger. Your nervous system mistakes distance for threat. So even when staying hurts, leaving feels worse. This is why many people cycle. They pull away. They come back. They promise themselves, this time is different. Not because they're indecisive, but because their system hasn't learned safety yet. You cannot think your way out of a pattern that was wired through emotion. And this is where compassion matters. Not the kind that excuses harmful dynamics, but the kind that helps you understand why your body reacts the way it does. You didn't stay because you lack self-worth. You stayed because connection matters to you, because you're capable of depth, of loyalty, of emotional presence. Those are not weaknesses, but in an avoidant dynamic, they go unsupported. So instead of being mirrored, they get muted. And over time, that muting creates the emptiness you feel. The void people talk about is not missing them. It's missing yourself. It's the gap between who you are and who you had to become to keep the relationship stable. And here's where the shift begins. Not dramatically, but internally. It begins when you stop asking, how do I make this work? And start asking, what is this costing me? Not angrily, not defensively. Honestly, what does it cost you to hold back truth? What does it cost you to wait for emotional permission? What does it cost you to love someone who can only meet you halfway? Because clarity doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from self-connection, from listening to the part of you that's been tired for a long time, the part that doesn't want more explanations or promises or future projections, just consistency, just presence, just emotional safety. And this is the moment many people fear, because once you truly feel the cost, you can't unfeel it. You can't go back to pretending that breadcrumbs are enough. You can't unknow how much you've been carrying. And this is where people think they have to make a decision, leave or stay. cut contact, or hold on. But the first shift is not external, it's internal orientation. You stop organizing your inner world around their limits. You stop waiting for cues to allow yourself to feel. You stop shrinking to preserve connection, not because you're done loving, but because you're done disappearing. And here's the quiet truth: avoidant dynamics don't end when you leave, they end when you stop participating emotionally, when you stop chasing coherence from someone who avoids depth, when you stop explaining your pain to someone who can't sit with it, when you stop translating your needs into something less threatening. This is not punishment, it's recalibration. You begin turning back toward yourself. Your body starts relearning safety. That doesn't depend on someone else's availability. And yes, at first, that feels empty because you removed the familiar tension. But emptiness is not absence, it's space. Space where your intuition returns, where your clarity sharpens, where your sense of self begins to reassemble. And slowly, the void stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like relief. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped abandoning yourself. At some point, something subtle changes. You notice that you're tired, in a way sleep doesn't fix. Not dramatic exhaustion, a quiet depletion. You're not crying all the time. You're not in constant conflict. You're just flat. That's the cost of emotional self-suppression. When your system learns that certain feelings lead to distance, it doesn't just hide those feelings from your partner, it hides them from you. You stop checking in with yourself because the answer is inconvenient. You stop asking, "Do I feel safe here?" and replace it with, "Am I asking for too much?" This is how self-doubt replaces self-trust. And avoidant dynamics thrive on this erosion, not because the avoidant is cruel, but because the system rewards disengagement. When you ask for less, things feel calmer. When you stop naming discomfort, they feel closer. So your body learns a dangerous equation. Peace equals silence. Connection equals restraint. Over time, this creates a split inside you. One part wants closeness, the other part manages the fallout of wanting it. You become both the child reaching out and the adult pulling yourself back. That internal tug of war is what drains you. And here's the part most people miss: you don't feel empty because you lost them. You feel empty because you've been buffering the relationship. You were absorbing the emotional labor, so they didn't have to. You were regulating their comfort at the expense of your truth, and your nervous system knows it. That's why your body reacts before your mind catches up. The tension in your chest, the knot in your stomach when you want to speak, the hesitation before sending a message. Those aren't flaws, they're signals. Your system has been carrying uncertainty for too long. And here's where coping advice often goes wrong. People tell you to detach, to be less invested, to stop caring so much. But detachment without safety feels like amputation. You don't heal by cutting off feeling. You heal by restoring choice. Real coping isn't about becoming colder. It's about becoming clearer. Clear about what your system can tolerate. Clear about what drains you. Clear about what you need to stay whole. And this clarity doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from noticing patterns. For example, notice how often you anticipate their moods. Notice how often you minimize your needs to avoid tension. Notice how often you feel relief when you don't ask for anything. Relief shouldn't come from self-erasure. That relief is your nervous system telling you it's been bracing. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. This is the moment many people confuse with giving up. But it's not resignation. It's reorientation. You stop trying to get water from a well that keeps running dry. You stop translating your feelings into something more palatable. You stop doing emotional gymnastics to keep the connection stable. And what replaces that effort is not immediate peace, it's discomfort, because you're no longer buffering. You feel the absence more sharply at first, because you're no longer numbing it. And this is where most people panic. They mistake discomfort for regression. They think, I'm worse without them. I'm falling apart. But what's actually happening is that your system is finally processing what it's been postponing: the grief, the anger, the disappointment, all the emotions you swallowed to keep things fine. This is not weakness. This is integration. And here's the key shift. You stop asking, how do I cope with them? And start asking, how do I support myself? Not in a performative way, not with affirmations pasted over pain, but practically. You give your body consistency. You create routines that don't revolve around waiting. You reduce exposure to triggers that keep reopening the wound. You don't force. No contact as a punishment. You allow distance as a form of nervous system hygiene. And slowly, your body learns a new association. Safety doesn't require suppression. Connection doesn't require self-loss. This is when the bond starts to loosen. Not because you decided to let go, but because your system no longer needs to cling. And something surprising happens here. Your thoughts about them become less urgent. You still think of them, but without the same charge. The mental spirals shorten. The urge to explain fades, not because you closed your heart, but because you reopened it to yourself. And this is the part no one prepares you for. As you stabilize internally, you may start seeing the relationship more clearly, not through longing, not through fear, but through accuracy. You notice what was missing, what you were carrying alone, what you were hoping would change. And this clarity is quiet. It doesn't come with anger or dramatic resolve. It comes with a steady knowing, a sense of, this isn't what I want to keep doing. And once that knowing settles in your body, you don't need constant reminders. You don't need closure conversations. You don't need explanations. Your system already understands. And here's where real strength lives. Not in walking away loudly, not in proving a point, but in no longer negotiating your inner stability for external connection. You stop chasing emotional safety from someone who can't offer it consistently, and you stop blaming yourself for wanting more, because wanting safety is not neediness, it's biology. There's a moment that arrives quietly, not when you stop thinking about them completely, not when the memories stop surfacing, not even when the attachment fully dissolves, but when you notice something deeper. You're no longer bargaining with yourself. You're no longer rehearsing conversations in your head, no longer rewriting the past to make it make sense, no longer asking questions that only keep you tethered. Questions like, was I too much? Should I have been more patient? If I had said it differently, would things have changed? Those questions lose their grip because your nervous system has shifted out of survival. You're not calmer because they finally showed up. You're calmer because you stopped disappearing. You stopped translating your needs into something smaller. You stopped holding your breath for emotional permission. You stopped calling inconsistency complexity. And that's when coping stops being about endurance and becomes about self-restoration. You begin to feel solid again, not high, not detached, not emotionally armored, just steady. Your body feels like a place you can return to. Your emotions feel like information, not threats. Your silence feels intentional, not desperate. You don't feel the urge to prove anything anymore. You don't need to show how healed you are. You don't need to explain why you stepped back. You don't need to make them understand what they lost, because the most important understanding already happened inside you. You finally saw the cost of loving someone who could only meet you when it felt safe for them. You finally felt how much energy went into maintaining a connection that required you to be less alive. And once you feel that truth in your body, not just your mind, you can't go back. Not because you're bitter, but because you're clear. This is where strength actually lives. Not in walking away dramatically, not in being unfazed, not in pretending it didn't hurt, but in no longer organizing your inner world around someone else's limitations, in no longer mistaking emotional hunger for compatibility, in no longer abandoning yourself to keep a bond alive. And here's the thing most people don't tell you. When you reach this place, you don't need closure. You don't need one last conversation. You don't need an apology or a confession. Your system already closed the loop, and that's real freedom. So if this video helped, you see your experience with more clarity instead of more confusion. If it gave language to something you felt but couldn't explain, subscribe. Not for quick fixes, not for dating strategies, but for content that helps you understand attachment, emotional safety, and self-trust at a nervous system level. And if one line landed for you, if one moment made you pause, leave a comment. Not to relive the story, not to justify your choices, just to mark the moment you stopped coping and started coming back to yourself. Because that quiet shift, the one no one else sees, is the beginning of everything.